I shouldn't have said anything, but silence felt worse than what came after. The first thing I remember is the sound of glass against marble, soft, expensive, controlled. Nothing like the way my heart was pounding in my chest as I stood there, tray in hand, trying to pretend I didn't see what everyone else had already decided to ignore. It was just past 9 p.m., the dinner rush settling into that polished, quiet rhythm where money spoke in low voices and no one raised their tone unless they owned the room. And I was halfway through my shift at a place where a single steak cost more than my weekly groceries when the door opened and let in a draft of cold November air and a man who didn't belong. He looked like he'd walked 10 miles in worn-out shoes, jacket too thin for the weather, hands slightly shaking. Not from fear, I realized later, but from exhaustion. And before he could even step fully inside, one of the security guys moved toward him with that rehearsed politeness that isn't polite at all. "You can't be in here," he said, not loud, not rude, just final. The man nodded like he'd heard it 100 times before, like rejection was just another step in his day, and turned slightly, already retreating, already making himself smaller, and something in my chest tightened in a way I couldn't ignore. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself I needed this job. I told myself people like me didn't step into moments like that and change anything. But then the second guard laughed under his breath. Just a little, just enough, and that was it. "He's not doing anything wrong," I heard myself say before I could stop, my voice cutting through the room in a way that didn't belong to me. Everything slowed. The guards turned. A few heads lifted from tables. The manager, of course, appeared out of nowhere like he always did when something threatened the illusion. "Emily," he said, warning wrapped in my name. "Handle your section." But I didn't move. I couldn't. He just came in from the cold. I added, softer now, but somehow louder at the same time. "You don't have to treat him like that." That was the moment everything shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a subtle change in the air, like pressure dropping before a storm. One of the VIP guests near the front, a man in a charcoal suit who'd been complaining about his wine 10 minutes earlier, leaned back in his chair and watched me with open amusement. "Is this part of the service now?" he asked, smiling without warmth. The manager's face tightened. "Apologize," he said quietly, stepping closer so only I could hear. "Now." I felt my fingers tighten around the tray, felt the weight of it dig into my palm. Apologize for what? For noticing? For speaking? For refusing to pretend? "No," I said, and even to me, it sounded small. But it was enough. The man in the suit stood, slow, deliberate, like he had all the time in the world, and walked toward me with that easy confidence that comes from never being told no. And for a second, I wondered if this was how it always started, not with something big, but with one choice that couldn't be taken back. And somewhere behind him, at a table I hadn't noticed before, someone else stopped moving entirely. I didn't see him yet, but I felt it, like the room had just remembered who it really belonged to. The man in the charcoal suit stopped just a few feet from me, close enough that I could see the faint reflection of the overhead lights in his watch, something sleek and silver that probably cost more than my car, and he tilted his head slightly like he was trying to decide whether I was amusing or inconvenient. "You are new here," he said, not as a question but as a conclusion, and I felt the manager shift beside me, his breath tight, his patience thinner than the glassware I was still gripping too hard. "She is apologizing," he cut in quickly, forcing a smile that did not reach his eyes, but I did not speak. I could not, because if I said the words, it would mean I believed them. The man's gaze flicked past me for a second, toward the door where the stranger still lingered, uncertain, half-turned as if waiting for permission to exist, and then back to me. "You are defending him," he said, softer now, almost curious. "Do you know him?" I shook my head. "No, then why?" That question hung in the air longer than it should have, longer than it needed to, and I felt every eye in the room pressing in, waiting for me to give them something easy, something dismissible, something that would let everything go back to normal. "Because he did not do anything wrong," I said, and my voice was steadier this time, even though my hands were not. The manager stepped closer, his tone dropping into something sharp and controlled. "Emily, enough." But it was already too late. The man in the suit smiled then, but there was no warmth in it, just a quiet kind of certainty, like he had already decided how this would end. "You are making this difficult," he said, and his hand moved slightly, not touching me, not yet, but close enough that I instinctively leaned back a fraction of an inch, and that was when the room changed again. It was subtle, almost invisible, but I felt it like a shift in gravity. Conversations at nearby tables slowed, then stopped. One of the servers near the bar froze mid-step, her eyes darting toward the back of the room. Even the manager's voice caught for a second, like he had forgotten what he was about to say. I followed their gaze without meaning to, my eyes landing on the corner table I had not noticed before, the one tucked just far enough into shadow to be overlooked unless you knew to look for it. He was sitting there, still as stone, one hand resting against a glass he had not touched, his posture relaxed in a way that did not feel casual at all. Dark suit, perfectly tailored. Dark hair, swept back with effortless precision. And eyes that were already on me. Not surprised. Not confused. Just watching. Like he had been watching this entire time. My breath caught in a way I could not explain. Like my body understood something my mind had not caught up to yet. And for a second, everything else faded into the background noise of clinking glasses and distant music. The man in front of me was still talking, still waiting for my response. But it did not matter anymore, because the person who actually mattered had already decided to pay attention. I did not know his name. I did not know why the air felt heavier with him in it. But I knew, with a certainty that settled, deep in my chest, that whatever happened next was no longer about a stranger at the door or a mistake I could take back. It was about him. And the moment he finally moved, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. He did not rush, and that was the first thing I noticed. The way he stood from his chair like time belonged to him. Like nothing in the room could move faster than his permission allowed. And as he stepped forward, the faint echo of his shoes against the marble floor seemed louder than it should have been. Or maybe everything else had simply gone quiet around him. Conversations dissolving into silence, forks pausing midair, even the music from the speakers fading into something distant and unimportant. The man in the charcoal suit turned slightly, irritation flickering across his face at the interruption, but it did not last long, because recognition came next, sharp and immediate, and with it, something else I had not expected to see in someone like him. Restraint. "This does not concern you," the man said, attempting a confidence that felt thinner now, stretched tight over something uncertain, but the other man did not respond right away. He stopped a few feet from us, close enough that I could see the details I had missed before, the precise stitching of his jacket, the way his cufflinks caught the light, the calm in his expression that did not match the weight of the room pressing in around him. His gaze moved, not quickly, not carelessly, from the man in front of me to the manager, then to me, and when it settled there, it felt like being seen in a way that made it impossible to look away. Not judged, not dismissed, measured. "She spoke," he said finally, his voice low and even, carrying without effort, and something about the simplicity of it made my pulse jump. No anger, no accusation, just a statement that sounded like it mattered more than it should. The manager cleared his throat, forcing a small laugh that did not belong in this moment. "Sir, it is just a misunderstanding. She will apologize and we will move on." "No," I said before I could stop myself, and the word landed harder than I expected, hanging between all of us like something fragile and irreversible. The man in the charcoal suit exhaled slowly, like his patience had run out, and this time his hand did move, reaching toward my arm with a familiarity that made my stomach tighten, but he did not get far. "Do not," the other man said, and it was not loud, not forceful, but it stopped everything. The hand froze in midair, suspended between intention and consequence, and for a second no one moved at all. The man in the suit let out a short breath, something between disbelief and frustration. "You are interfering over a waitress," he said, as if the word itself explained why this should not be happening, why I did not matter enough for this kind of attention. The other man tilted his head slightly, considering that, and then his gaze shifted again, past all of us, toward the door. "Let him stay," he said, and it took me a second to realize he was talking about the stranger, the man who had been almost invisible until now, still standing just inside the entrance like he did not trust that this was real. The manager hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough to tell me everything I needed to know. This was not a request. "Of course," he said quickly, turning to the guards with a sharp nod that carried none of the authority it had a minute ago. The tension in the room shifted again, but this time it did not ease. It settled, deeper, heavier, like something had been decided beneath the surface. I felt it in the way people avoided looking directly at us now, in the way the man in front of me took a small step back without realizing he was doing it, creating space where there had been none before. And then those eyes returned to me, steady, unreadable, holding mine just long enough to make my breath catch again. "You should be more careful," he said quietly, not unkind, but not gentle either, and I did not know if it was a warning or a promise. Kindness has a cost. For a second, I thought that was the end of it, that his words would settle everything back into place, that the room would breathe again and people would return to their meals like nothing had happened, but nothing about the way. The man in the charcoal suit looked at him, suggested acceptance. Only calculation, the kind that came from someone who was not used to being corrected in public. "You are making a mistake," he said, quieter now, careful, like every word had to be chosen with precision, and I realized then that whatever power he thought he had a moment ago, it did not measure the same way here. The man beside me did not react immediately, did not argue, did not raise his voice, and somehow that made it worse, because silence stretched between them like something alive, something that demanded to be understood without being explained. The manager shifted again, his hands clasping and unclasping in front of him, caught between two forces he did not control, and I could feel the tension crawling under my skin, settling into my chest in a way that made it hard to breathe normally. I should have stepped back. I should have said something safe. But I stayed where I was, frozen in place by the weight of it all, by the awareness that I had crossed a line I could not see before. "Mistakes imply uncertainty," the man said finally, his tone still even, still controlled. But there was something colder underneath it now, something that made the air feel sharper. "I am not uncertain." The words were not loud, but they carried, and the reaction was immediate, subtle but undeniable. The man in the suit exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction, like something inside him had shifted from confrontation to retreat without him fully realizing it. "Of course," he said, forcing a thin smile that did not quite hold. "There is no need to escalate this." No one had said the word escalate, but it hung there anyway, heavy and implied. The stranger by the door took a hesitant step forward, then another, guided by a small gesture from one of the guards who had suddenly become very careful about where they stood and how they moved, and I watched him disappear into the background of the room, no longer a problem, no longer invisible either, just allowed. That word echoed in my head longer than it should have. Allowed. I did not understand why that felt so important, but it did. The man in the charcoal suit adjusted his jacket, smoothing it down with a controlled motion, reclaiming whatever dignity he could salvage, and then he glanced at me one last time, not with amusement now, but with something sharper, something that promised this moment would not be forgotten as easily as everyone else wanted it to be. "Be careful who you defend," he said quietly, just for me, before stepping back toward his table, his presence shrinking the moment he chose to let it. The manager let out a breath he had been holding, turning toward me with a look that was equal parts relief and warning. But before he could speak, before he could pull me aside or remind me how close I had come to losing everything, the man next to me moved again. Not away, closer, just a step, but enough to shift my entire awareness back to him, to the way his presence seemed to rewrite the space around him without effort. I felt it in the way people avoided looking directly at us, in the way even the lighting seemed harsher, clearer, like nothing could hide in it anymore. "You work here," he said, and it was not a question, just another quiet observation that landed heavier than it should have. "Yes," I managed, my voice softer than I intended, my throat suddenly dry. He studied me for a second longer, not rushed, not distracted, like he was deciding something I could not see, and then his gaze flicked briefly toward the door where the stranger had been, then back to me. "Next time," he said, his voice lowering just enough that only I could hear, "make sure you understand what you are stepping into." My breath caught again, not from fear exactly, but from the weight of that sentence, from the sense that this was not a warning about tonight, but about something bigger, something I had already set in motion without realizing it. And then, just like that, he stepped back, the distance between us returning as if it had never been broken, leaving me standing there with a tray I had forgotten I was holding, a job I was not sure I still had, and the quiet, unshakable certainty that my life had just tilted in a direction I could not control. I tried to move, to return to my section, to pretend that I was still just another server carrying plates and smiling at strangers, but my legs did not quite cooperate, like my body had not caught up to the idea that the moment was over, even though everyone else seemed determined to act like it was. The manager finally found his voice, sharp and controlled again now that the immediate tension had passed, and he stepped in close, lowering his tone so it would not carry. "Kitchen. Now," he said, not looking at me directly, not wanting to draw more attention, and I nodded before I could think about arguing, before I could decide whether I should even still be here. The walk to the back felt longer than it should have, each step heavier, each second stretching as the quiet murmurs of the dining room slowly returned behind me, like a wave receding after crashing too close to shore. I pushed through the swinging door into the kitchen, and the noise hit me all at once, the clatter of pans, the hiss of burners, voices calling out orders like nothing had changed, like the front of the house had not just tilted on its axis. "What happened out there?" Maria whispered as she passed me, her eyes wide, but I shook my head slightly, not trusting myself to explain something I did not fully understand. The manager followed a second later, the door snapping shut behind him, cutting off the last trace of the dining room. And for a moment, he just stood there, looking at me like he was trying to decide whether to be angry or relieved. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" he asked finally, his voice low but tight. I opened my mouth, then closed it again, because the honest answer was no. Not really. Not completely. "I was just trying to help," I said instead, and even to me it sounded too small for what had just happened. He let out a breath that was almost a laugh, but not quite. "Help?" he repeated, shaking his head once. "You do not understand the kind of people who come through that door." I thought of the man at the table, the way the room had shifted around him without a single raised voice, and something cold settled deeper in my chest. "I think I am starting to," I said quietly. The manager ran a hand over his face, glancing toward the door like he expected it to open again at any second. "If he had not stepped in," he said, not finishing the sentence, not needing to. I knew, or at least I thought I did. But that was not the part that stayed with me. It was the way he had looked at me. Not like I was in trouble. Not like I was a problem. Like I was something else entirely. The thought made my stomach tighten in a way I could not explain. "Who is he?" I asked before I could stop myself, and the manager's head snapped up, his expression changing instantly. "You do not ask that," he said, almost too quickly, like the question itself was dangerous. That was answer enough. I nodded slowly, looking down at my hands, noticing for the first time that I was still holding the tray, my fingers locked around the edge like I had forgotten how to let go. I set it down carefully on the prep counter, the metal surface cool under my palm, grounding in a way nothing else had been for the last 10 minutes. "Go home after your shift," the manager added, softer now, but no less serious. "And keep your head down." I nodded again, even though something in me resisted the idea of shrinking back into safety, of pretending none of this mattered. Because it did. I could feel it in the way my pulse had not settled, in the way the air still felt different even back here, removed from the dining room. I turned slightly, glancing toward the swinging door without meaning to, and for a second, I wondered if he was still out there, if he had already left, if this was just a moment that would fade into something I would question later. But deep down, I knew better. This was not over. Not even close. And whatever line I had crossed tonight, I had a feeling there was no going back to the version of my life that existed before it. I finished the rest of my shift on autopilot, moving through tables and orders like my body remembered what to do even when my mind refused to settle. Every sound sharper than usual, every glance from a customer feeling heavier than it should have, and no matter how hard I tried to focus on normal things like refilling water glasses or balancing plates, part of me stayed locked on the front of the room, on the corner where he had been sitting, even when I told myself not to look. I only allowed myself one quick glance near the end of the night, a small, careless turn of my head as I cleared a nearby table, but the chair was empty. The glass he had not touched was gone. No sign he had ever been there at all. Somehow that felt worse. Like the entire moment had been something I imagined, except I knew I had not, because the weight of it was still sitting in my chest, steady and undeniable. By the time my shift ended, it was close to midnight, the restaurant finally quiet, Lights dimmed to that soft glow that made everything look less real, less permanent, and I changed quickly in the back, pulling on my coat with hands that still did not feel completely steady. Maria caught my arm before I could leave, her voice low but urgent. "Emily, seriously, what was that?" I hesitated, searching for an answer that made sense, but nothing did. "I do not know," I admitted, and it was the truth in a way that felt deeper than anything else I could say. She studied my face for a second, like she wanted to push further, but something in my expression must have stopped her, because she just nodded slowly and let go. "Be careful," she said, echoing words I had already heard tonight, and that did not make me feel any better. Outside, the air hit colder than before, the kind of chill that settled into your bones within seconds, and I pulled my coat tighter as I stepped onto the sidewalk. The city quieter now, but not empty. Distant traffic humming, streetlights casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement. I started walking toward the bus stop 2 blocks down, my footsteps echoing faintly, my mind replaying everything that had happened in pieces that did not quite fit together. His voice, his eyes, the way the room had changed. I told myself it was over. That people like him did not think twice about moments like that. That I was just another passing detail in a night full of them. But the thought did not stick. It slipped away. Too easily. I was halfway down the block when I noticed it. Not a sound exactly, not something I could point to, just a feeling, like the space around me had shifted again in that same subtle way from earlier, like I was no longer alone, even though the street looked empty at first glance. My steps slowed without meaning to, my breath catching slightly as I glanced over my shoulder. But there was nothing obvious, just a parked car with dark windows and a streetlight flickering above it. I told myself I was imagining things, that my nerves were still too high, that this was what happened when you let one moment get too big in your head. And then the car door opened. Not fast, not sudden, just deliberate. The kind of movement that made it clear it was not a coincidence. My heart stuttered once, hard enough to hurt, as a figure stepped out, tall, composed, familiar in a way that made my stomach drop before my mind could catch up, and I did not need him to step fully into the light to know exactly who it was. I should have kept walking. I should have pretended I did not see him. But I stopped, because something in me already understood what he had said earlier, what I had stepped into without realizing it. And as he closed the distance between us, slow, controlled, like he had all the time in the world, I realized this was not a coincidence. Not a chance encounter. Not something I could walk away from. "You left," he said, his voice quieter now, without the weight of a room behind it, but somehow more direct, more personal, and I swallowed, trying to find something steady in a moment that felt anything but. My shift ended. I managed, and he held my gaze for a second longer than necessary, like he was measuring something again, something I still could not see. "Good," he said finally, a single word that carried more meaning than it should have, and then his eyes flicked briefly down the street before returning to me. "Because now," he added, softer this time, "we can talk without interruptions." For a moment, I did not say anything, because I was not sure what kind of conversation this was supposed to be, not sure what rules applied here or if any of the normal ones still mattered, and the way he stood there, hands relaxed at his sides, shoulders loose like this was the most natural thing in the world, only made it harder to find my footing. The streetlight above us flickered once, casting a brief shadow across his face, and in that second, I understood something I had been trying not to see all night. He was not just someone who walked into rooms and changed them. He was someone who expected them to change. "I do not think there is anything to talk about," I said carefully, even though my voice came out quieter than I intended, and I shifted my weight slightly, as if reminding myself that I could still leave, that I was not actually trapped here. His gaze did not waver. "There is," he replied, calm, certain, like the answer had already been decided. "You intervened in something that did not concern you." The words were not harsh, but they were direct, and they settled between us with a weight that made it clear this was not casual. I felt a flicker of defensiveness rise, small but steady. Someone was being treated unfairly, I said, meeting his eyes this time, even though it took more effort than I expected. "That concerns me." Something shifted in his expression then, not quite surprise, not quite approval, but something that made his attention sharpen. "That is a luxury," he said after a second, his voice lowering slightly, like the words were meant only for me. Caring about fairness when you have nothing at stake. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding, the cold air stinging my lungs. I had something at stake, I said. My job. And you risked it anyway. It was not a question. I nodded once, because there was no point denying it. He studied me again, longer this time, like he was trying to understand something that did not quite fit into whatever expectations he had. And for a second, I wondered what he saw, what conclusions he was drawing from a moment that, to me, had felt impulsive and inevitable all at once. Most people do not, he said finally. Most people look away. Maybe they should not. I replied, and the words came out steadier than I felt, anchored in something simple and stubborn that I could not seem to turn off. The corner of his mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile, but close enough to make my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear. That is where you are wrong, he said quietly. Sometimes looking away is what keeps you alive. The statement landed heavier than anything else he had said, and for a second, the noise of the city seemed to fade again, leaving just the two of us standing under that flickering light. I thought about the stranger, about the way he had almost disappeared before anyone even noticed he existed, and something in me resisted the idea that that was the safer choice. And sometimes, I said slowly, choosing each word, it is what lets everything stay the same. Silence followed, but it did not feel empty. It felt measured, deliberate, like something important had just been placed between us and neither of us was rushing to move it. He took a step closer then, not invading, not threatening, just closing the distance enough that I could see the details I had missed before, the faint line near his eyebrow, the way his eyes held steady without needing to prove anything. Do you know who that man was? He asked, and the shift in topic caught me off guard. I shook my head. No, good, he said, and something in the way he said it made my stomach tighten again, because it did not sound like relief. It sounded like a decision. His gaze moved briefly past me, scanning the street in a way that felt instinctive, practiced, before returning to mine. Because if you did, he continued, his voice dropping just enough to make the words feel closer, more personal, you might have made a different choice. I swallowed, the implications settling in slowly. Would that have been better? I asked, not entirely sure I wanted the answer. He held my gaze for a second longer, something unreadable flickering beneath the surface, and then he shook his head once, almost to himself. Not for him, he said. Then his eyes returned to me, sharper now, more focused, like whatever he had been deciding was finally clear. And not for you, he added, softer this time. Because now you are involved whether you understand it or not. The word involved settled into my chest like something solid, something that could not be ignored or undone. And for a second, I just stood there, trying to decide whether this was a warning I should listen to or a line I should refuse to cross. But the truth was I did not know enough to make that choice. Not yet. I did not agree to anything. I said finally, my voice quieter now, but still holding on to what little control I felt I had left, and he watched me for a moment like that response mattered more than it should. You did not have to, he replied, calm as ever, and there was something in that answer that made the night feel colder than it already was, like the rules I understood no longer applied in the same way. I crossed my arms slightly, more for stability than defiance, the chill biting through my coat as the city hummed faintly around us, distant headlights passing, someone laughing somewhere down the block, normal life continuing just a few steps away from whatever this was. Then explain it, I said, because if I was already standing here, already caught in this moment, I needed something more than half answers and quiet warnings. For a second, I thought he might refuse, that he would just repeat the same vague statements and leave me to figure it out on my own. But instead he glanced down the street again, that same careful awareness threading through his movements, before looking back at me with something more deliberate in his expression. The man you defended, he began, his tone shifting slightly, less distant now, more precise, was not just looking for somewhere warm. I felt my stomach tighten, my mind replaying the moment at the door, the way the stranger had stood, the way his eyes had not quite matched the rest of him. What do you mean? I asked, even though part of me already knew I was not going to like the answer. He carries information, he said simply, and the words felt heavier than they sounded, like they held layers I could not see. Information that other people would prefer remain hidden. I let out a slow breath, the implications settling in piece by piece, not dramatic, Not explosive, just quietly. Unsettling. And you? I asked, because that part mattered too, maybe more than anything else. Where do you fit into that? For the first time since he stepped out of the car, there was a pause, not long, but enough to make me notice, enough to tell me that this answer was not as automatic as the others. I make sure that information is handled correctly, he said finally, and it was the kind of answer that sounded straightforward while saying almost nothing at all. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so clearly incomplete. That does not actually tell me anything, I said, and this time, there was no hesitation in my voice. Something flickered in his eyes then, brief but unmistakable, like I had just crossed another line without realizing it. But instead of shutting down, he stepped a fraction closer, lowering his voice just enough that the words felt more private, more intentional. It tells you enough, he said. Enough to understand why speaking up tonight was not as simple as you thought. I looked at him, really looked this time, at the control in his posture, the certainty in his tone, the way nothing about him suggested doubt, and something inside me shifted, not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that made everything feel sharper, clearer, harder to ignore. So what happens now? I asked, because that was the part that mattered, the part one could not pretend away. He held my gaze for a second longer than necessary, like he was measuring the weight of that question, like he was deciding how much to give me and how much to keep. Now, he said slowly, you stop pretending this is a normal situation. The words landed heavier than anything else he had said tonight, not because they were loud or threatening, but because they were true in a way I could not argue with, and for a second, neither of us moved, the space between us filled with everything that had not been said yet. Then he straightened slightly, the shift subtle but final, like a decision had been made. And you come with me, he added, his tone calm, almost casual, as if he was asking something simple, something ordinary, even though nothing about this felt that way. My breath caught, my instinct pushing back immediately, telling me to step away, to refuse, to walk in the opposite direction and not look back, but my feet did not move. My mind caught between caution and something else I could not quite name, something that had been building since the moment I chose not to stay silent. Why? I asked, because if I was going to take another step into this, I needed a reason, something solid to hold on to. He did not answer right away. Instead, he looked at me like he had already considered that question long before I asked it, like the answer had been waiting. Because, he said finally, his voice softer now, but no less certain, you already proved you will not walk away when it matters. I should have said no, and for a split second, I almost did, the words sitting right there on the edge of my tongue, ready to push everything back into something simple and safe. But the truth was, nothing about tonight had been simple since the moment I chose to speak, and pretending I could step away now felt less like control and more like denial. I looked past him for a second, down the street that should have felt familiar, the bus stop just a block away, the route I had taken 100 times without thinking, and it hit me how far away that version of my life already felt, like it belonged to someone else, someone who had not just been told she was involved in something she did not understand. When I looked back at him, he had not moved, not rushed me, not pressured me, just waiting with that same steady patience that made it clear he was not guessing what I would do next. He already knew. That realization settled in quietly, but it stayed. This is not normal, I said, more to myself than to him, but he heard it anyway. No, he agreed, and there was no attempt to soften it, no reassurance that things would somehow return to what they had been. It is not. The honesty of that answer made it harder to pretend I could negotiate my way out of this with logic or distance. I took a slow breath, the cold air grounding me just enough to think clearly, to understand that whatever choice I made here would not just end tonight, it would define what came after it. If I walk away, I said carefully, watching him, what happens? It was the question that mattered, the one that would decide everything, and for the first time, he did not answer immediately. His gaze held mine, steady, unreadable, like he was weighing something I could not see, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, not weaker, just more precise. You will not, he said. Not you cannot. Not you should not. You will not. The certainty in it should have made me angry, should have made me push back harder, but instead it did something else entirely. It made me realize he was not trying to control me. He was stating what he already understood about me, about the choice I had already made hours ago when I refused to stay silent. I exhaled slowly, the fight draining out of me not because I had lost, but because I saw it clearly now. This was never just about tonight. You think you know me, I said, but there was no real accusation in it, just a quiet acknowledgement. I think I know what you did, he corrected, and somehow that was more accurate than anything else he could have said. The city moved around us, distant and indifferent, cars passing, lights changing, people living their lives without noticing the line I was standing on, and for a moment, I let myself imagine stepping back from it, turning away, going home, pretending this was just a story I would tell myself later. But the image did not hold. It broke too easily, because I knew I would think about the man at the door. I would think about the way the room changed. I would think about this conversation and every unanswered question that came with it. And I would not be able to leave it alone. That was the part he understood. That was the part one could not deny. I looked at him one more time, really looked, at the calm in his posture, the control in his presence, the absence of anything that suggested hesitation, and something in me settled, not into comfort, but into clarity. If I go with you, I said slowly, choosing each word, this does not end tomorrow. It was not a question. It was a condition. He did not hesitate this time. No, he said, just as simply. It does not. The honesty should have scared me more than it did, but instead, it felt like the only real thing left in a night full of things I did not understand. I nodded once, not because I was certain, but because I was done pretending I could stay out of it. Then I am not going to pretend I am not part of it, I said, and the words felt heavier than anything I had said all night, like they carried weight beyond this moment. Something in his expression shifted then, subtle but unmistakable, not surprise, not quite approval, but recognition, like I had just confirmed something he had already decided. He stepped aside then, just enough to open the space between us and the car, not forcing, not guiding, just making it clear the choice was mine to complete. I hesitated for half a second, just long enough to feel the edge of what I was leaving behind, and then I moved. The door opened before I reached it, smooth, quiet, deliberate, and as I slid into the seat, the city outside suddenly felt farther away than it had a moment ago. He closed the distance a second later, the door shutting with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have, sealing something I could not undo. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The engine started, low and controlled, and the car pulled away from the curb without hesitation. I watched the street disappear through the window, the place where everything had started shrinking into the distance, and only then did I realize the truth of it, the part that settled deepest of all. I did not just step into his world. I chose it, and somewhere between that choice and the road ahead, I understood something that would not leave me. He did not raise his voice. He did not force my hand. But tonight, he changed everything without asking for permission.